Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reforged podcast. My name is Drew, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the fourth chapter of Lee Strobel's book, Case for Christ, and we're going to continue our series and discuss corroborative evidence today. That's a hard word that I'm probably going to mess up multiple times during this podcast. I also want to mention before we get this episode started, I have noticed that there's been a couple audio issues in the last couple episodes, and I apologize for that. I've been trying a couple different things to fix that and mitigate that, but it seems like the issue keeps popping up. So I'm going to be doing a more thorough screening of all my episodes and having some people listen to them and make sure that all the content is there before uploading them. I apologize for the inconvenience and the issues in quality that caused that, and I hope that this solution will help with that. Um, Also, I want to just lift up a couple prayer requests that I have this week. My dad had a surgery last week on his knee, and he's recovering well, doing good, and the knee itself is fine, but he's been in a lot of pain just because his leg has been sore, and he's have just some discomfort with that. And so, just prayers for continued healing and recovery over that. Um, and hopefully that will get resolved soon so he can get back in action. Um, Also, just prayers for my family. I have a relative who is struggling in old age with some different health issues, and that's been hard on some of my family members. So I just appreciate some prayers for that. Um, and yeah, if you have any prayer requests of your own, please feel free to leave those in the comment section on the YouTube or the Spotify episode, and I'll be happy to take a look at those and be praying for you. All right, without further ado, let's get into today's content. So, first of all, a definition of what corroborative evidence is. Corroborative evidence is evidence that supports existing testimony. So, it affirms essential eyewitness details that are recorded in other evidential accounts. And the general idea is the more corroborating evidence you have, the stronger your original account is. So, in the case of the Gospels provide an account of who Jesus is. And if there are outside sources outside of the Gospels and outside of even the Bible in general that talk about Jesus' existence and his ministry, even if they don't go as in depth, even if they're not as thorough, and even if they aren't meant to be supportive of the message of Jesus being the Christ, just the mention of that builds legitimacy that historically Jesus was in fact a person who walked the earth and had cultural relevance. In this chapter, Lee Strobel interviews a Dr. Edwin Yamauchi. He teaches at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio at the time of this interview, and he's an ancient history scholar. So he has a bachelor's in studies of Hebrews and Hellenistics. He also has a master's and a doctorate in Mediterranean studies. He also has been a member of several different fellowships or councils that do historical research. He's written several papers, given several lectures, and he's actually been published in a lot of journals. And he's also participated in some personal archaeology excavations. And so the first thing that Lee Strobel, the first question that he poses is, are the Gospels historically reliable? And Yamauchi says that they are the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources that we have for Jesus and his ministry. They provide the most detail, and they're the most concrete. There are also incidental sources outside of the Gospels, such as the different letters written by Paul, or even outside of the Bible, other scholars that provide some corroborative evidence. And that's really what Lee Strobel is looking to ask about in this chapter. And so they start talking about a little bit of a summary of some of those outside sources. They talk about how there are works by different historical figures such as Josephus and Tacitus, and how they had writings that mention Christ. They talk about the idea that while few people fully believed in Jesus as being the Christ, being the Messiah, during his ministry, during his life on earth before his death, despite that, after his resurrection, there were many who did believe and who did know his name and preached his gospel message. And if you think about it too, there's many other historical figures in the Bible like Herod and Pilate, who have much more political and cultural relevance to a lot of the audiences of the time. They weren't just teachers; they were rulers. However, they're lesser known compared to Christ, and outside of their relevance to Christ, outside of the accounts that we receive of them in the Bible, few people know or think much about these figures. However, many believers were impacted by the existence of Christ, and Yamauchi adds that there are many people who were not believers of Christ who ignored this, that Christ was not relevant to, and so he wasn't recorded. But to the people that he were, they were very passionate about sharing the good news. So they first look at some of the work from Josephus. If I look at my notes here, Josephus was an important Jewish historian who wrote near the end of the first century after Christ. Josephus was a religious figure. He was a priest or a Pharisee. Yamauchi adds that he was also sort of an egotist, and so he wrote some very self-laudatory works. In fact, in his autobiography, he writes about his actions during the Jewish-Roman War, and essentially there were a lot of religious elites who chose to commit suicide when invaded by Rome, because they did not want to yield or associate with the power of Rome. However, he yielded to the Romans, Josephus did. And in his autobiography, he defends his choices of doing this, and he also defends Rome as a whole. He praises Rome quite often. His most ambitious and most well-known work is called the Antiquities, and it's a history from the creation all the way up to the present at that time. It's a full Jewish history. And in that book, there's references to James and Jesus. So James being the brother of Jesus and Jesus himself. There's references in his writings to them. He mentions in his writing the different motivations and methods of which James, the brother of Jesus, was killed. He mentions that there was a priest named Ananias who utilized a power vacuum when the current emperor died in order to convene a meeting with the Sanhedrin and claim that James was being heretical and defiling the law as grounds to stone James, to have him killed. And now this account too that we have from the Antiquities of James, it's undisputed to be the original text. It's not something that people suspect is an addition by Christian writers later on in history. This is undisputed to be part of the original content of what Josephus wrote. It also corroborates Jesus's claim of being the Christ. It says in the writing, James, brother of Jesus, who was claimed to be the Christ, or who was called the Christ. And so while it doesn't necessarily have a stance that's in agreement with the fact that Jesus was the Christ, Josephus is not making a claim that Jesus was the Christ. Josephus is making the connection that this is the same Jesus that people were calling the Christ, the same Jesus that people believed was the Messiah. There's also another passage called the Testimonium Flavinia, which is a lengthy and controversial passage that Josephus wrote about Jesus. And there's been sort of history on the consensus of if this was a legitimate original document written by Josephus or if this was made by Christians later on. So early on in history, especially in the audience of many Christians, the Christians appreciated what Josephus wrote here as an authentic attestation of who Christ was. And then during the Enlightenment, many scholars tried to question the legitimacy of, was this really written by Josephus? Now, in the modern day, there is a consensus among those who are scholars of Jewish history and those who are scholars of Christian history. There's a consensus that this is an authentic writing, so originally written by Josephus. However, there are some what are called interpolations. And what interpolations are, where they were additions that are suspected to be inserted by Christians who are copying the manuscripts. And so these aren't examples of things that Christians changed what Josephus was originally writing, but they added in language that would suggest the legitimacy of the claim that Jesus was, in fact, the Christ and the Messiah. And so, to give an example of that, there's a sentence in there that says, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man." And it's believed and agreed upon that this was the original writing of Josephus, because, I mean, while Jesus was a very wise man, most people who are Christians don't refer to Jesus as being a wise man. They refer to him being as the Son of God, the Christ. Um, and so they recognize his divinity in that. And this does not do that. And so it seems very consistent with Josephus's writing style and his tone and his background. Compare this to the follow-up sentence, which is, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Now, that earlier claim, again, seems consistent with Josephus, but this one seems to be a Christian idea. It also seems like something Josephus wouldn't write, because it suggests that Josephus himself considers Jesus to be the Christ, to be greater than just a man, to be also God. And so it's believed that that's something that Christians actually added to supplement his text, but that's not originally what Josephus himself wrote. Another example of this is a place where in that passage it says he was the Christ, whereas in the passage that we saw earlier from Antiquities, Josephus said he was called the Christ. And so it doesn't seem consistent for Josephus to in one place say he was called the Christ, to acknowledge the fact that people claimed him to be the Christ and thought of him as the Christ, but to make the distinction that maybe he doesn't particularly believe that, to then be confident to say he was the Christ. And so the general consensus is that the original passage, minus the few interpolations like that, was in fact about Jesus and was written by Josephus. And the original, even if we take out those interpolations, it still corroborates the fact that Jesus was martyred. It still mentions in that passage, which you can read those passages in the full book that he's referencing. In those passages, it still references the fact that he was martyred, he was killed for his faith, he was killed for his claims about who he was, and then also that believers that followed him were killed for what they believed. That Christ had a large following, that he was crucified specifically, and it corroborates those things without necessarily affirming Josephus's own personal belief in these deistic claims that Christ was making. Now, something that Lee then asks about is, why doesn't Josephus mention Christ in greater detail? He wrote of many other relevant figures to the Christian faith, such as John the Baptist, in much greater detail, and why didn't he write as much about Christ? And Lee Strobel also raises the question, is skepticism of Christ's existence warranted by this? Is the fact that Christ isn't mentioned more by Josephus reason to believe that Christ maybe didn't even exist? Now, Yamauchi points out that there's an overwhelming consensus and an overwhelming amount of evidence for Jesus' existence, and that the claim that Jesus didn't even exist as a man is quite a lofty and flawed and unreliable claim. Even some of the most devout atheists in the world, they're not going to agree that Jesus didn't exist. They're going to disagree that Jesus was the Son of God. They're going to disagree in the idea of God entirely, but they're not going to debate or disagree with the fact that Jesus did at least exist. And so he sort of dismisses that claim because of that. But he also points out that Josephus's writing, as does any writing, it had a purpose and a tone, and Josephus's writing was mostly politically relevant to Rome. And since John the Baptist took on a more zealot-like role, living on the outskirts in the wilderness, baptizing people, and dissociated from the Roman Empire, it seemed that John the Baptist was a more threatening character to the Roman authority in the status quo. Whereas in contrast, Jesus was not a zealot. He was not passionate against the rulership of Rome. In fact, in Scripture, there are references to where Jesus, agrees with the idea of paying taxes to Rome. He's not against that. And so Josephus has a strong reliability in reliability. There we go. In what he had wrote in depth about, such as the different wars that the Jewish culture went through. And so his authenticity in what he did write of Jesus is likewise reliable. Now we kind of pan over and we look at the Tacitus references. And so Tacitus wrote in AD 115 an explicit reference and statement of the persecution of the Emperor Nero of Christians. And so Emperor Nero had painted Christians as the scapegoat for a great fire that had swept over Rome in about AD 64. And so, as Tacitus writes, he writes of Nero persecuting these Christians. He also perhaps references belief of Christians in the resurrection of Christ. He says that they had believed in a mischievous superstition. And so the questions kind of raise what he meant by that. It seems to suggest that he's referring to their belief in a resurrection. At the very least, though, what Yamauchi points out, because he doesn't make a specific claim on if that's true or not, but what he does say is that it does at least make clear that there was a very large movement centered around Christ, the Christian following, and this is centered around his crucifixion. And crucifixion is, even in Tacitus' own writing, described as a horrible and a dishonoring, disgraceful death. And so this is corroborating evidence from an unsympathetic outside source that Jesus was crucified. And it does raise the question, at the very least, why are so many people following him? Why are so many people going to follow someone who died in this way unless they have a true belief that somehow he's more powerful than that death? Then we look at a reference from Pliny the Younger, who was a nephew of an encyclopedist, Pliny the Elder. And his correspondence with Emperor Trajan was preserved throughout history. And so he has many different books of the letters that he was written preserved. And in Book 10, there's a letter written likely around AD 111 that mentions different arrests and executions of Christians. And what this corroborates is that there's a very strong worship of Jesus among Christians, that they're treating and worshiping Jesus as if he was God, and also that they have a steadfastness and committed faith that they would even face execution as a consequence of not recanting their belief. Another interesting point is that during the crucifixion, it's mentioned in the Gospels that there was a period of time that the earth went dark, and there are mentions of that in other historical sources. The works of Thales, around AD 52, he wrote of different Mediterranean histories in that time. And his original works are lost, but they're quoted by another scholar, Julius Africanus, who wrote around AD 221. And he referred to this period of darkness in his writings, but he justified it as an eclipse. However, Africanus, in his commentary on this quotation, disagrees with this claim and finds it unreasonable. Historically, in that writing and in others, the quote-unquote eclipse was seen by parts of Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean places. It was a cosmic event. It was reported by a Greek scholar named Charia, and he said that a nighttime was experienced at noontime, that there was a darkness and that stars in the sky were visible, but it was only noontime. He also said that there were earthquakes and other phenomena across the land occurring. And so it seems unlikely that this really was eclipse. It seems that these people were realizing and recognizing this event that corresponded with the crucifixion of Christ, and that's corroborated here. And although they thought it was an eclipse, it seems to be the same event. And it seems that it was not an eclipse, but they still reported on it. Another question that Lee Strobel brought up is the differences in the perception of the character of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the man who crucified Christ. In the New Testament, he seems to be willing to yield to the pressure of the Jewish mob. He doesn't want to crucify Christ, but because the Jewish mob demands that he does, he gives in and he does. However, in different outside historical accounts, outside of the biblical history, he's seen as an obstinate and inflexible ruler. And this isn't actually contradictory. It's actually just circumstantial. Yamauchi points out that Pilate's patron, or his supporter, his advocate in higher government, was a guy named Sejanus, and he was deposed in AD 31 because he was revealed to be plotting against the emperor at the time. So Pilate's authority at this point is weak, and Jesus' crucifixion takes place around AD 33, and so you could assume that the reason that he avoids the ensuing riot of Jews and yields to them is to an attempt to maintain order and to not cause a scene and trouble that would further weaken his authority and get him in deeper trouble with the emperor. Another thing that Lee Strobel and Yamauchi discuss is that there are Jewish accounts of Jesus, such as in the Talmud, written around AD 500. This is another part of Jewish teaching. It's outside of the Bible, the Old Testament that they read, but it's supplemental works. And so the Jews do not detail those that they believe to be heretics in their writings very much. However, they do at least mention Christ in their writings. They mention him as a false Messiah, a magician. They believe that his condemnation and crucifixion by the Roman Empire was just because he was believed to be a heretic, and they believe that he was born of Mary and a Roman soldier. So while this is painted in a negative light, as it's painting Jesus fraudulent and deserving of death, it's still corroborating the fact that he did perform miracles when they talk about magic, that he was a great teacher with a great following and many disciples. It still details those things. Now, if we're looking at evidence outside of the Bible, even further, Lee Strobel poses the question, wouldn't there be more non-religious sources of Christ's existence? But Yamauchi points out that usually writings about religious figures won't begin until the figure is well established. And although it might seem sparse, the writings that we have of Christ, Christianity still has the most documented evidence of their religion and their religious leaders. We look at a couple alternative examples, such as the Gathas of Zoroaster, who they were around 1000 BC, but their scriptures weren't actually written down in writing until 300 AD, and the biography of Zoroaster was not written until 1278 AD. And so there's quite a big time gap there. We also look at Buddha, which many are familiar with. In 600 BC was when he lived, and his biography wasn't written until 100 AD. Or we look at Muhammad, the prophet, big figure in Islam, and he lived in AD 570, and the Quran that writes of him was not actually written until AD 767. And so if you look at the recency and comparative relevancy of the writings we have of Jesus, it's very impressive, because we have accounts, we have Paul's letters written like within 100 years of Christ's life. Now, Lee Strobel also asks, if we didn't look at any of the gospel writing, if we just looked at these other outside sources, what picture of Jesus would we have? And Yamauchi summarized it that we'd still know that Jesus was a Jewish teacher who was believed to be a healer and an exorcist, who was believed by many to even be the Messiah, that he was rejected by Jewish leaders, he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and his followers believed in his resurrection, and that all kinds of different people, men and women, slaves and free, people of different races, they all worshipped him as God, not as man, but as God. And then to go further into the mention of Paul too, Paul did not encounter Jesus before his death and resurrection. Paul was a devout Jewish man who actually was persecuting the Christian church. But then he had a vision and a meeting with Christ, and he completely transformed his life. His letters were penned before the Gospels were written, but they were still penned after he worked to establish Christian doctrine and teaching with the apostles, with the disciples, the followers of Christ. And so they're really authentic in serving as external verification to Christ's life. They have many references to Christ's life in them. It lists that Christ was a descendant of David, that he was the Messiah, that he was betrayed by one of his own, that he was tried in the Roman court, that he was crucified, that he died for his sins. That he died for our sins, that he died for the sins of others, resurrected 3 days later, that he was witnessed after his resurrection by many, including his brother James. And while Paul doesn't mention specific parables or miracles that Jesus performed, he is focusing on what he believes is to be most crucial to the faith, that information of Jesus' heritage, his divinity, and his death and resurrection for our sins. He also references the character of Christ. He references Christ's humility, his obedience to God his Father, his love for those who are sinful. He mentions that Jesus is the Son of God and made in the image of God, that he is the image of God. In spite of the prior monotheistic and devoutly Jewish background that Paul had, he's claiming that the deity of Christ is intrinsic to Christian belief. And so some have claimed that perhaps non-Jewish, the Gentiles have added this claim of Christ's deity in retrospect to biblical writing, but the letters of Paul show that that's not the case. Now, there's also writings from authors that come from after the New Testament, known as the Apostolic Fathers. There are epistles written by Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Barnabas. And specifically, Ignatius emphasizes the deity and the humanity, that duality of Christ. He emphasizes the martyrdom of Christ as well. And we look at all these fathers writing their works and experiencing persecution and still standing firm in their belief. And if we just think about it, the best explanation for how these Christians' ideas spread so rapidly, so widely, is that they were legitimate. Why are there so many people who are claiming a belief in the resurrection of a man who was not just killed but crucified on a cross shamefully? Why are there so many people giving their life to him? Why are there so many people committed to him that they would even face their own suffering, persecution, and death because of it? It's because they believe it's true, and that's because it is true. There are several creeds of different churches and accounts of Christ and Christianity throughout history that you could look at in addition to what was mentioned in this chapter. And the chapter even has some additional references that I didn't share on the show. But honestly, in the opinion of Dr. Yamauchi, in the opinion of Lee Strobel, and in my opinion, the best explanation for the hold and credibility and staying power of Christianity and of the Bible and the documents that it has is the accuracy of them. They are verifiably true, both by their own evidence and by the corroborative evidence that we have. And so that's just something interesting to get to think about this week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed, please share that with your friends and family. Anyone that you think would benefit from hearing this kind of content, love to share it with them. I'm looking forward to continuing in chapter 5 here. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. God bless you all, and remember, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.